I only needed
If you tested for 2 days in a row,
this day
negative.
3 negative.
Yeah, then you're good.
Day 3 negative? Yeah.
I'm thinking like when
All
you
right.
start.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now live on YouTube.
All right.
Cool. And everyone that we expect to join is joined.
Yes, and trustee Harper will not be joining today.
Okay, so welcome everybody to the Personnel and Ordinance Committee for the trustees. Today is June 7th, time's 4:05 p.m. and I call this committee meeting to order. And we'll note that trustee Jim Harper is not able to make it today, but everyone else expected is in attendance.
Yeah. All right, thank you. So today's discussion, thank you, I can finish this up. Today's discussion will start out with TJ and Chris informing the trustees of our current process for identifying properties to apply to the Army Corps for disturbance permit. And which after review does not require an ordinance to create that process. It is something that would be done internally. And then the ordinance in the packet was the ordinance that was presented to the Planning Commission and ultimately sent to the board with their recommendation. And then we pulled that to kind of go back through this process so that it went through the proper channels, since we weren't given direct trustee direction to write a local ordinance, only a jurisdictional one. But after review, we can open this up for TJ and Chris. And Chris is our newest CPS as well, so I wanted to introduce you all to Chris. And Chris, this is our P&O committee here.
Hi, Chris.
Okay.
We'll try not to call you Katie.
Yeah.
That's not a problem. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So hello, I am Chris. I'm one of the contracted town planners from CPS. For you all today is Emergency Ordinance 2023-06 regarding wetland protection. Silverton's Compass Master Plan and Development Readiness Assessment expressed the need for water quality regulations, specifically in regard to wetlands. The current internal process for staff includes reviewing wetlands inventory maps to determine if proposed developments are in proximity to wetlands. If wetlands are present, staff requires the applicant to submit to the Army Corps of Engineers for their review. The Army Corps of Engineers only regulate jurisdictional wetlands, and if they determine the wetlands are not jurisdictional, no further review is required by either the Army Corps of Engineers or the town. Earlier this year, the EPA redefined waters of the United States. The new definition is less strict than the previous definitions and could change how the Army Corps of Engineers regulates jurisdictional wetlands in Silverton. Currently, Silverton does not have any local regulations in place for wetland protection. The intent of the proposed ordinance is to create a disturbance permit, as well as creating a set of standards to follow when developing either within a wetland or within a wetland setback. The proposed ordinance includes a new definition for wetlands to better suit the town's current needs. This ordinance also proposes changing the definition for wetlands in the zoning code definitions, so there aren't multiple definitions for one word within Silverton's municipal code. Disturbances to wetlands or the associated buffer, even if are not jurisdictional through the Army Corps of Engineers, will require to be reviewed under the town's standards under this ordinance. The disturbances would be approved by the Board of Trustees following the review and recommendation by the Planning Commission. The proposed wetland ordinance outlines standards for wetland disturbances, which includes a 25-foot wetland buffer. Wetland buffers are important as they provide an area to reduce adverse impacts to wetland functions from adjacent development. Wetland buffers also moderate stormwater runoff, provide essential habitat for wetland-associated species, and reduce adverse effects of human disturbances on wetland habitats. The proposed 25-foot buffer is a standard distance utilized by many communities. However, the town may adjust the buffer distance or decide not to regulate a wetland buffer in this ordinance. The proposed wetland ordinance is also includes a mitigation ratio of 1-for-1. This would mean the applicant would be required to mitigate at least the same amount of wetlands they disturb during development. The 1-for-1 mitigation ratio is typically the minimum required, and some jurisdictions require a mitigation ratio of 2-for-1. The Silverton Compass Master Plan discusses creating environmental land use policies that allow future generations to enjoy the quality of life which is experienced today, in addition to recognizing wildlife and their habitats with land use policy changes. The action items of the Silverton Comprehensive Master Plan include prioritizing and clearly defining environmental and wildlife habitat protection as part of the Land Use Development Code, as well as factoring in future air and water quality measures into the building design for future projects. On May 16th, the proposed wetland ordinance was presented before the Planning Commission. Their discussion included the 1-for-1 mitigation requirement was a good start for wetland mitigation. The 25-foot buffer may be too large based upon some 25-foot lot widths and whether the $500 fee is appropriate. Not all commissioners were in support of the wetlands ordinance and associated buffer. However, they moved to recommend that the Board of Trustees approve the ordinance with a request to evaluate the buffer distance to ensure wetlands are protected, but still ensure the maximum use of a property.
Can I pause you there for a second?
Sure.
Do you know who the two were that
I do.
voted no? Who were they?
Jim and Melissa.
Jim and Melissa. And do you know what basis they voted no for? Did they explain why?
Jim did a little bit. Do you want to speak to that?
I think that, and Chris was there. Chris was there, so he can also fill in, but I don't think that I think one issue they really had was with the 25-foot buffer, with our lots being so small in town, and that was too restrictive and would cause significant impacts on development in town.
Yep, that's it.
Gotcha. And was there meaningful discussion at that meeting about the jurisdictional versus non-jurisdictional wetland regulation?
I would say we discussed it, but it wasn't the main topic. It was more the regulations that would be put in place.
Okay, thank you. All right, sorry to interrupt. Please keep
You're
going.
fine. And that was the end of the presentation, so I'll open it up to further discussion or any other questions.
Can you guys hear
I was
me?
supposed to be in that planning commission meeting.
Yes,
Oh,
you can.
sorry, Clay.
Thanks, Clayton.
Oh, hey guys, I can't see it myself. I'm looking at like a PowerPoint, so sorry to be awkward.
Oh,
I wanted to update.
Unshare.
can we unshare the
all-
PowerPoint? Sorry, 1 second. We'll just be able to see
Yep.
each other. There we go.
There we go. Thanks, guys. I wanted to update you guys on the Sackett versus EPA decision. That was something that is going to affect the jurisdictional wetlands. So we are waiting on Sackett to determine, without getting into the details, basically it was a fight over what is jurisdictional versus non-jurisdictional. And that particular case was decided that the Clean Water Act only applies to jurisdictional wetlands. And the language they used was, waters of the United States, meaning those navigable waters covered by the EPA and Department of the Army, Corps of Engineers, that are, as a practical matter, indistinguishable from waters of the United States. And so what it did is it broadened, well, actually, I would say it lessened the impact of the Clean Water Act. And now, basically, if it's not a part of what's considered a navigable water, is not going to be protected or jurisdictional under that. And so it's actually kind of a groundbreaking determination. It's going to change the way we've dealt with jurisdictional wetlands and the EPA for the past 40 years. And so what people are, what you're doing is you're probably a step ahead of a lot of other people who are now scrambling to put local protections in place for those who want it. So I just wanted to update you there because the mayor brought up the jurisdictional versus non-jurisdictional, and that's a very big piece of this pie that you should be aware of as you kind of, discuss this particular ordinance.
So, yeah, could you restate just the
I was gonna say, restate to make sure
the headline that goes out to the community?
like
You just-
jurisdictional wetland protection will decrease going forward. There will be less
Yes.
protections for jurisdictional.
There
less
will be
inclusive in the
there will be
definition.
no adjacent wetlands. There will be only those wetlands that are indistinguishable from navigable waters. So you will not ever have a little pocket of wetland pretty much ever again, unless you can't tell where the wetland begins and the navigable water ends, and vice versa. I'm gleaning some of the language from the, reading the case conclusion, but it significantly constrains the definition of a wetland as far as Department of the Army and Corps of Engineers is concerned and the EPA is concerned. It will be, I'm sure they're going to fight it, but that's where we're at.
Now, that said, Chris, from your perspective, like I'm looking at the GIS or whatever the Colorado Wetland Inventory map. The jurisdictional wetlands in Silverton are limited to pretty much the entire eastern flank of town along the Animas and the southern flank of town along South Mineral. And there's 0 jurisdictional wetlands within the town itself, except for one little green spot that seems to be like on Shrine Hill, pretty high up. I'm not seeing anything else in this map within the 0.8 square miles of town besides adjacent to the Animas and adjacent to South Mineral. So I would just, unless you think otherwise, I'd clarify that even though this case may change how wetlands are viewed in other places somewhat dramatically, our wetlands are already pretty much indistinguishable from navigable waters. And so those will likely remain protected as jurisdictional wetlands. Does that all sound like relatively fair as a statement?
I just to go back a little bit on some history that I think, through the Roberts Road and some of those other projects that led to a lot of this. Excuse me, those wetlands in years and years and years ago were identified as jurisdictional, and then through definition reasons were then determined to not be jurisdictional. And I think your statement is correct that what this is doing is really constraining things to the rivers themselves, and anything kind of disconnected from those. Tangibly on the surface disconnected would no longer, and this ruling that Clayton just mentioned would make that even more strong, would not be considered jurisdictional and therefore would not be covered or protected under the Army Corps.
Gotcha. And the conclusion that I was attempting to draw is that based on what's currently what was protected 2 weeks ago and what's protected post this decision in Silverton is likely to remain more or less the same because it's all already adjacent to 2 rivers. And it's not like we had these former pockets of jurisdictional wetlands like around Roberts Road protected as
And
jurisdictional
losing their
wetlands.
protection as a result of this recent case.
Yeah, so this recent case doesn't seem to have a massive impact on Silverton itself because the changes that unprotected some of our wetlands already happened a while ago.
And I would just make a note that the Colorado Wetland Inventory was created using aerial imaging and data. So no, what's on that map is not a delineation that's been done on the ground. It's more aerial photos. So I would say there's possibility that there could be more in there just because they haven't done action on the ground. But I would agree with you on that.
Okay. Thank you. So I wanted to take like more of a procedural step back in terms of what we're looking at and how we got here and why we pulled the packet or pulled this from the meeting packet, and then kind of figure out what the right way is to move forward where we don't have like a a presumption one way or the other
Mhm.
because of the procedural
Yeah, and
steps.
so the board directed staff to, and this was at the beginning or at the very end of the, kind of the Roberts Road and that project, to look into, coming up with some kind of an ordinance or process that staff would do to identify a jurisdictional wetland. And, in talking with, our planners and kind of how that process was look, we are already doing that. So if we go to a site visit and we say, look, there's a willow there, I need you to apply to the Army Corps for a disturbance permit to see if you are in fact on a jurisdictional wetland. And so that process, as we were looking at it, didn't really make sense to put into an ordinance at this point. What we did find was that looking at our watershed protection area had really nothing to do with wetlands in town. Because it's like 3 miles outside of town on each side. So it really didn't impact anything to do with wetlands in town. So we're thinking, well, we do need a definition of a wetland if we wanted to go the route of identifying these wetlands and potentially protecting them. And that's where I think we went a little too far in our assumptions of what we had heard and came up with this ordinance. Which then went to the planning commission, and then it was pointed out that this wasn't the direction of the trustees. The original direction was specifically for jurisdictional wetlands, which we feel like we already have a process in place for and does not need to be codified. So that is why it was pulled from that meeting packet and brought back to the Personnel and Ordinance Committee to talk about this wetlands ordinance in more detail and if we wanted to pursue it like on a next agenda.
Right. Okay. And so the board's pretty split on this issue in terms of whether or not we want to protect wetlands further or beyond jurisdictional wetlands. And my concern about the process so far and what this is teeing up is that now instead of being in a position where we didn't have something and it would be like an affirmative step to prepare something, we now have something and it's more like the momentum is with protecting non-jurisdictional wetlands. And it's a higher burden now to like stop the process if that's not what the board wants. And so I'm a little bit concerned about that because I think that there's valid arguments that the process for determining whether or not a property falls within this proposed ordinance would be pretty subjective. And we would have similar issues like we did with Roberts Road on everything going forward by attempting to protect non-jurisdictional wetlands. And in any case, I think there's a valid argument that it's problematic. And I don't know what to do at this point to say like, are we the right body to say this wasn't the direction given? Like if staff has determined that jurisdictional wetlands are sufficiently protected and our process is sufficient, that's the end of it from right now, unless the board gives direction to pursue non-jurisdictional wetland protection. Or do we need, because time and effort has been invested in this, do we still need to present it to the board, even though it wasn't the direction provided by the board, to then have the board say in front of the community, which has a portion, which I don't know how significant it is, if it's a majority or minority that feels very strongly about non-jurisdictional wetlands, and put the board in a position to say, we're not going to pursue this, or have some people on the board say, we're not going to pursue this. And that's reigniting something that we just experienced that didn't necessarily need to happen if we followed, I think, what would have been the right process.
Right.
So now I'm just not sure the right way to handle this today.
I think something that came up at the planning commission meeting, which I was supposed to attend but unable to because of my dog emergency, but I rewatched it last night, the wetlands portion of it. And I think something that might be helpful perhaps to go through to just do the exercise, maybe even flesh it out a little further, is Katie did this, but I think you could do it as well, Lucy. Like the idea of the process. So like, I actually think we could just kind of look at this map and let's imagine that you're a property owner and you own property on, let's look at it and
Let's do
say,
Roberts Road again. Let's just use that use case because we're all familiar with it. Or the property next to it. That's a non-jurisdictional wetlands where there's presence of wetlands that, specialists have said, this is a wetlands.
Mhm.
So what happens at that point? And so what was
Yeah, so I
what's the
think-
specific language that we follow here? Like if someone's looking to pursue this, it says,
For which language?
so based on the proposed ordinance,
Mhm.
what's the process that governs? Like, how do we go step by step?
Yeah, so
through
you're a
this?
property owner and you are applying for a building permit and town staff comes out to your property and they take a walk around and flag the first, are you jurisdictional or not? And looking at our town map.
Was that how it happens? Like, what's the very first thing that
Okay,
happens?
I actually think you should just start this and kind of do it, what you did for the planning commission, I think would be really helpful.
Yeah, so the first step, and Chris and TJ, interrupt me if I'm misspeaking here, but what we currently do right now in the planning department is if someone is talking about wanting to develop a property, we look at the hazard map and we spot where all the hazards are. After that, we look at the Colorado wetland inventory map, and wetlands are not a hazard. That is an environmental concern. And if we see that they are in close proximity to something that's been flagged on that map, which is an areas of concerns map, then we would kind of have a discussion, potentially go out and do a site visit, which would be done by John Sites usually or myself. And then we would kind of determine from there if we think this person should bring to us a determination of whether there are wetlands there or not. And using that determination, they would then, if it comes back that there are wetlands on the property, using that determination, they would.
Jurisdictional or non-jurisdictional?
Yes, so that part's not just a presence of wetlands.
Yeah. Sorry, if I might just jump in real quick, because it's a kind of a two-step process. Designating the wetlands as either there or not, and then determining whether or not they're jurisdictional or not.
Right.
So it's two, and then kind of the third is then you apply the standards. Sorry, Lucy.
No. Thank you for stepping in. Yeah, so as TJ was saying, you'd first determine whether or not there are wetlands on the property, and then you'd go, if yes, then you'd go to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They would look into it, and then they would give their, sorry, I used the wrong word. You first get a delineation, then they would give their determination, whether or not those are jurisdictional or not. And then from there, if they're non-jurisdictional, right now, then we would say, okay, you can develop. And if not, then they would go through the federal process to develop on the land. And that doesn't have anything to do with us, really. We would just receive all of those documents from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so this is where the change would happen if this was adopted. Then they would have to go through the process. They would have to go through, whether jurisdictional or not, they would have to submit the wetland disturbance permit that we have brought to you today, and go through our local process for determining development on or around wetlands. Does that sound?
And then and I think you could probably continue if it was helpful, but I think at that point is when the private entity secures their professional engineering consultant, and that information comes back to the town to provide the information of what is factually present or not. So if that consultant comes back to the town and says, there's no presence of wetlands here, jurisdictional or non-jurisdictional, that's like the stamp, you have your full lot to develop, unless there's some other constraint or issue with it. If that engineer comes back to the town and says, this is the location of the wetlands, then I think the other portion of the permitting process comes into place. It would be then the buffer, the setback, the potential disturbance 1-to-1 ratio. And I think that's it.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just make a clarification, Sally? I apologize if I maybe misunderstood, but just to be absolutely clear, the engineer, the surveyor would come in at the very beginning, right? So they would submit something and say yes or no. It might just be a property owner that says no, but then that's where Lucy was saying they'll do a site visit if it's close to make a determination to make a finding on whether or not a delineation is needed. Then they come in and, like we saw on Roberts Road, there was a line that showed the wetlands delineation. So that came into the town at the application submittal period. So it's early on that process would happen on the professional side. Then that's the plan that would then go to both, that would be sent with the wetland delineation, that line would go to the Army Corps to determine if it is jurisdictional or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'm great with the process up to the point that we get the delineation and it says, okay, there's a wetland. And then we go to the Army Corps and they say, yes, this is a jurisdictional wetland. I'm good to that point. If they say, no, it's not a jurisdictional wetland, but there is an identified wetland from the delineation, it's from that point on that I have a bunch of concerns. And I'm going to put on just so it's clear, I'm putting on my advocacy hat. I'm taking off my moderator hat. When I was talking about procedure and where we're at, I was attempting to be moderator because I think we're in a different position substantively than we would have been with a different procedure. And we may end up with a different outcome because of procedure. Now, I'm very much advocating for what I think, which is town is 0.8 square miles. There's a lot more in our master plan about keeping town affordable, increasing density, using our infill and maximizing, not creating an urban sprawl, like not seeing, a bunch of building up in the mountains around Silverton. I think that there's a good case to be made that us limiting development for non-jurisdictional wetlands within our 0.8 square miles creates more harm than good. For a bunch of reasons. One is that not all wetlands are created equal. Anytime you see a non-jurisdictional wetland, regardless of its size or the actual substance of it, it's going to fall within this subjective process that's going to go through the town staff and ultimately to the board to make a decision about whether or not they can get a disturbance permit or not, and what that process is going to take. And every time that happens, if there's a community member who happens to have the bandwidth that is on the protect the wetlands side of things, it's going to turn into what we just experienced. And that is likely going to dictate the outcome of the trustee decision, not whether it's subjectively or objectively right or wrong or good or bad. It's going to depend on when did it come up? Did people have time and were they paying attention? And I don't know that that's the right way to decide who should build and who shouldn't, where, like in different spots in Silverton. I also think about how, some wetland, with any buffer at all, like if it clips the corner of a building lot, that entire building lot is now unbuildable if we keep a 25-foot barrier. And then I don't know how to protect wetlands that should be protected if we don't have a 25-foot barrier. So that seems to, that for me, I just dead end in terms of logic, like neither outcome seems correct. But if we limited the wetlands we were protecting, then I think the amount of property that would be impacted by the 25-foot buffer seems much more reasonable. But I'm very much concerned with the subjective nature of the likely outcome of non-jurisdictional wetland governance. That's my advocacy moment. And that if it were just me, I would just stop right now. And I'd say if the community really wants to have non-jurisdictional wetlands protected by Silverton, they should vote on it in the general election, and someone needs to care about it as much as they cared about OHVs and put it to a full community vote. And that I don't think it's this to me and the amount of impact it would likely have on properties throughout Silverton seems just as detrimental as when the trustees tried to make the OHV decision and we got recalled for it. So I would say we have no business making this decision right now, but it's not just me. So.
Yeah, and I think for the purposes of this discussion, it's more of a process issue at this point of like, okay, do we present this? Do we not present this? It has been presented. We realize that wasn't the direction and we need help kind of if we want to do a next step, or do we kind of drop this here? I guess that's where we need help.
Yeah. Well, my advocacy makes me see things very clearly one way. And I would say as a committee member, I would say this is done. Like we should just put pause on this. I think it was really good work that went into it, but I don't think it's work that we should have done yet. But that's also like, I'm not able to separate myself from what I think the outcome should be on this one. So.
And is it okay if I tease out a little bit of what you were just talking about?
For sure.
So you had mentioned it's subjective, and I think I totally understand that, but I want to tease that out a little bit. So through the process of it. So when somebody owns a property and they want to submit something, I think what we're talking about procedurally is that we would require that an applicant submit a wetland delineation. Is right. That means go out, have a scientist or somebody qualified to do that, identify it, and then it's on the map. I just want to make sure that we're on the same page.
I'm 100% with you. Yeah.
Okay,
once the delineation says this is a wetland.
Yes. Okay.
I'm with you to there. That's not subjective. That's
right,
not likely. No.
And I think where I want to go is this disturbance permit component is probably the really subjective part. Now, also a 25-foot setback is not subjective either. And again, I'm just trying to tease it out a little bit because if it does come forward, we certainly want to try to remove as much ambiguity and subjectivity as possible.
Sure.
So the delineation itself is not necessarily a subjective part, at least on town staff side, right?
No, not at all.
Professionals to say, here it is. And then the Army Corps to say, yes, it is, or no, it is not. Now, also a kind of a clarification that I believe that these wetland regulations would apply to both jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional, right? So it's not an either or. This would apply across the board. It's more strict, if you will, than the Army Corps regulations.
Sure.
So I apologize if that's kind of
No. I'm fully with you. And once we find out that it's a jurisdictional wetland, I think that's game over for a developer. It's this property. This is a wetland. It's protected. We're keeping it. The Animas River corridor, that's staying undeveloped. South Mineral Creek corridor, staying undeveloped. The rest of town, all the Roberts Road stuff, I think that should be open to development.
Well, and I'll try just giving some other examples of that. We're working in a couple other communities that are big in ranching and ag. And after 20 years, 50, 100 years of irrigation and flood irrigation, there are human-made, human-caused wetlands. And we're running into that quite a bit. We're dealing with a community at, Rio Grande County, where we're going through that right now. So what you're talking about is real. You have irrigation ditches, and those create false wetlands. I think what we're seeing more in Silverton, and I call false wetlands as in it's stagnant water and not necessarily natural per se. What we're seeing in Silverton more is snow runoff that's pooling and causing some of that stuff after long term. So again, I'm not a scientist in that, but those are some of the anecdotal things that we're seeing across the state that kind of play into this determination as well.
Right. And so it's the part that I think subjective and problematic that's worth getting into in a limited number of circumstances. So let's say it's a jurisdictional wetland and someone's proposing to do something that's, let's look at the disturbance criteria and the submittal requirements and all that kind of stuff. Like once we get there and it's talking about, permitted disturbances, and one of them is it's for the benefit of the community or something like that. The proposed activity is primarily for the promotion of the safety, health, and general welfare of the Silverton community, and the public benefit is greater than the impact to the wetlands. Now imagine having that discussion here with a bunch of community members that are like, no disturbance is ever worthwhile, and other people being like, but we need another school and this is the only place we can put it, or like whatever it is. I mean, that's not a conversation I want to have with private developers for houses.
I think as it is right now, we're going to have those discussions if we have another application. And that is one reason why we brought this to your attention. And yes, I see that, but this provides more of a framework.
But we won't have those discussions if we affirmatively choose not to regulate non-jurisdictional wetlands.
Right.
We're only going to have those
No,
discussions if
Because
choose-
we didn't actively choose that in Roberts Road,
I know we didn't,
but that was the nature of the discussion.
right?
And so I don't think we can say that just because we don't have something in place will mean that we don't need to have those discussions. Those discussions will still come up, and the outcome of those discussions will be, oh, look, and the town doesn't have anything in place to protect these non-jurisdictional wetlands.
Right. And that's,
And we'll say, yep, we still don't.
and I think that the whole last few months should have been cut off immediately, saying, we don't have the authority. This is not something we can decide. But because we hadn't had this conversation yet, and all the conversations over the last few months, we said, let's explore what it would look like if we did have the authority. Where I'm coming out is we still don't have the authority, and I don't think we should, because even with the proposed non-jurisdictional wetland ordinance that's in front of us, we'd be in the position where we do have the authority, but it's still this subjective determination each time about what we allow and what we don't allow. And so
Even with the early professional coming in with delineation.
yeah, because that's either way. So
Yeah,
so either
but
way,
that's okay.
so let me walk through the process one more time, just so it's super clear. You buy a property,
Mhm,
you get a wetland delineation no matter what, because it's undeveloped and you don't know.
mhm,
It comes back and it says it is a wetland or it isn't a wetland.
mhm,
Let's assume it is in this case.
mhm.
And this happens for all properties all the time already,
Every
and will
single-
continue happening no matter what.
Right.
Then that delineation gets sent to the Army Corps to say, is this a jurisdictional wetland or not?
Mhm,
Today, if the Army Corps says it's not,
mhm,
that's where it should end. And with Roberts Road, that's where it should have ended.
mhm.
And that's what the property owners did. They then proceeded to pursue development
Totally.
because we have no basis for telling them they can't
Yeah,
once we get there. But a bunch of people in the community said, whoa, this is really important. We should have a basis. And we're like, but we don't. And then they like looked at a bunch of different things. They looked at loopholes of us like not doing the watershed portion appropriately. And it really was like an administrative loophole that caused us to look back at this, that got us into this
Yes.
mess.
yes.
Now we're saying, like, policy wise for the community, should we still not have the authority? Or should we decide we want to have the authority and we do want to protect wetlands that are non-jurisdictional within the town of Silverton? And what I'm saying is, right now we have a really easy bright line test that we can stand up to that says we chose not to have authority.
Mhm,
If it's not a jurisdictional wetland, it is developable. And that's where the process ends. If we pursue this, then we do have authority to say some are developable and some are not. And if they are developable, there's all these other circumstances that we can tag onto them, like one remediation, certain buffers, a bunch of other restrictions. So like some of the things in here include developing the property to limit the disturbance as much as possible, but that's super subjective as well.
mhm.
So it's like, okay, based on the grading, like we have the best access, which doesn't limit the disturbance, or we can make a road that has like a not great grade and cuts all the way around the property and comes in from the top
Mhm.
to not disturb the wetland. Like
Mhm,
and those are decisions that the trustees are going to be asked to decide
mhm.
if we pursue something like this ordinance. And so my big concern, even if I didn't think we should, even if I thought we should protect non-jurisdictional wetlands, I was
That's
still
what I
get
wanted to
stuck
say.
on procedure because I don't know how to do it in a way where the board isn't going to have meetings just like the Roberts Road meetings over and over and over again every time this comes up. But if we choose not to deal with it, then we look like bad guys, probably, but we keep it nice and clean. Unless the community gets so upset that we do that, they put it to a vote. which they should if they care about it that much.
I kind of wanted to look at this as like, so let's just take it from, like, let's, for a moment, if we can kind of play an experiment game. Like, let's say that we're someone who is all in wetlands. We believe that wetlands are important environmentally. They're a serious resource for Silverton to be stewards of. And while we might be comfortable with some housing projects, we're generally going to side on the side of wetlands. How does that person interpret this ordinance? Because potentially, like, that person could look at the ordinance and say, I'm not satisfied.
Oh, they're definitely not gonna be satisfied
Because
either.
this ordinance means that this person could still come in and they can still build in this property, and all they have to do is a one-to-one remediation, which we don't even think works that well here. And 25 feet isn't enough. And I'm just trying to sort of imagine,
For
like,
sure. And they're gonna be they're gonna have as much mistrust of the process as I am, because they're gonna be like, maybe they have a pro-development group of trustees that are just saying yes to all these disturbance permits left and right, and putting the minimum number of like requirements on them because we're allowed to, because it's very subjective what we allow and don't allow. And I think this is probably a model ordinance that's like pulled from other best use scenarios, but there just isn't a good way to do it. Like, I don't think that the ordinance has a flaw because it could have necessarily been done better. I just think it's a process that's really hard to manage. And the goal, I think, of the board is not to be put in that position with that much frequency.
but if the goal of the board is to manage resources, you know, so someone comes to the board and says, well, it says in the master plan that you're going to preserve and protect
So I would
environmental resources.
I would offer a
What does
binary
that look
solution.
like?
I would say when you get to the wetland delineation, if it says there is a wetland, that's full stop, whether it's jurisdictional or not. There shouldn't be this like intermediate ground. Like, the only way for it to be clean is if you're either going to be super pro environmental protection of
right.
wetlands,
That's
and you
where I
can
wanted to
say,
go.
if there's a wetland on your property,
So you're like, okay,
and you can't develop keeping a 25-foot buffer, done. No staff review, nothing. If there's a wetland delineation, done. Or we say, if there's a wetland delineation and it's non-jurisdictional, you're good to go. I think those are the only two ways that help us avoid a lot of drama.
I really like this conversation, but
But we need to,
also to keep us in the bounds of like, so I guess what I'm looking for is if the entire board voted or gave direction as a board, and the majority of the board said, we want you to continue hashing out this wetlands ordinance, or we want you to look at the non-jurisdictional wetlands, and we want to protect those, and we want to give staff direction to protect those, then we bring up this ordinance. Until that time, we as staff can't really bring up this ordinance. Now, I don't think we were completely off base on when we do look into things, we want to give you some kind of structure, something to show you so that you're not just like, you know, like that's our job.
Like,
Is
what
to
are the
see
ways
the
of
best
protecting
practices
that?
out there,
Yeah.
put it into paper and show it to you all and say, here it is. Like, what do y'all think? But we weren't given that full direction, but this is what would come of that either way, if we were given that direction to go the non-jurisdictional route. So what I would say is we wait, and I know this sounds kind of like pushing it off, but really we need that direction from the whole board and then to have these discussions.
but so I think from what I heard today, the determination from staff was, we feel pretty comfortable with how our code treats jurisdictional wetlands,
Mhm.
and that we don't have a flaw or a problem. And that's the report back to the board. Do we want to pursue jurisdictional wetland regulation? We've done a lot of work already. It wouldn't be a big lift for us to present something that we think is actionable to you. But I think it needs the caveat of like pursuing non-jurisdictional wetlands will create a lot more work for staff and trustees than we would need to pursue right now if we kept things as they are. And I think that footnote's important because the first time we talked about this, your concern was that we don't even have the bandwidth to consider regulating non-jurisdictional wetlands, but now we figured out that it's not quite as bad as we initially thought. But I do think the outcome of this would create a whole lot of drama and work still. And I think that that's a reason to consider whether or not we pursue this or not.
I mean, I wouldn't put staff capacity as a reason to consider a policy. It's really like the policy dictates our capacity. And so I would just throw that out there. Like if the master plan is identifying things and the trustees feel strongly, then we
Figure it out.
We figure it out and we find a new way.
Sally, I did most of the talking. I'm curious what your thoughts are now that I've like fully regurgitated all of my feelings.
No, I mean, I think what I'm trying to consider is how do we respond? How do we, without, this came up in the planning commission meeting. Like I think there was some discomfort with this idea that it's an emergency ordinance. So like what makes it an emergency? And that's, the title it needs to move quickly through the process. And, there's the idea of sort of the spirit that of there being, how do we balance the development needs of the community with the, very real desire to protect and steward the land and just the general constraints of the valley itself. So I think like planning commission had a really extensive conversation similar to this one. And I think as an ordinance, they were like, we are really just looking at this as an ordinance. So for them, they didn't get into this, like, where are we in the process? They were just looking at, would we recommend this as an ordinance or not? And they did, but we don't necessarily have great feedback from them on like, should it philosophically be an ordinance or is this the best way to go about protecting the wetlands? In my thinking, I was comparing it to like a big mapping project and I'm not in favor of a big mapping project of properties in Silverton. And this, I thought, struck a balance between something like that big and sweeping and saying, well, if you're an individual property owner, this is something that you take on and we do it sort of project by project so that it's not some enormous policy and regulation that the town is suddenly involved in, like being wetlands experts. I think we need to stay out of that too. I guess I'm stuck because I do want to honor the idea that Silverton is we have environmental stewards who live here and we represent them and we want them to feel heard. And maybe this ordinance is not the right way to go about that, but I guess I just don't know what is. And I don't think it's a good idea. I do think that I think we'd have support from the board. And I think the board could support this ordinance. But I think if we were to bring it to the board and there would be division with it.
4-3 one way or the other.
Right. I think we have to consider the impacts of that.
What else?
It's kind of like, how do we weigh cultural division with wetland protection, with housing development?
So I care the most about process and drama. Way more than that.
Right.
So like, I would be perfectly happy if the community was
If
strongly
the
in favor
community
of
said,
protection.
we think this is the best way to protect wetlands.
Not this ordinance. No, I don't support this ordinance either way, because I think this creates process issues and drama. But I would be totally fine if the community said, we are gonna go hardcore. Like, I want to see bright line test one way or the other. And I think it's possible we either don't regulate non-jurisdictional wetlands and anyone can develop anything that is a wetland, but not jurisdictional wetland. Or we say any wetland is protected. I'm good with either way.
Yeah, I hear
with
you.
no exceptions other than maybe a couple for the town for, some of the things that were mentioned in permitted disturbances.
So my comment on the
Process
ordinance
and string-
specifically
Yeah.
is is the piece early in the process when you're going to the consulting engineer, and that's coming back with the delineation, because in the Roberts Road project, I felt like we had plenty of objective professionals that were bringing us with a 180-degree opinion on that property. And I guess I was a little concerned with the ordinance, with the permitting process, or with the help me with that. The thing you fill out, the application. The disturbance permit. And the disturbance permit, you go to your person, and your person said, you pay them to give, and I know they're professionals, and so they need to do their work with integrity. But I was just a little concerned that it seemed like in the spectrum of opinions, of factual scientific opinions, we had 180 degrees of disagreement on that in the Roberts Road. So my biggest concern with the ordinance kind of landed there. That didn't come up at all with the planning commission. So they discussed more, the 25 feet and the fee, and I don't know. So those are my thoughts.
The recommendation I would make that honors everybody's opinion is, I think we should have a wetlands policy discussion at the board level to talk about whether to pursue jurisdictional, or whether to pursue an ordinance or any protections for non-jurisdictional wetlands. And I think in that discussion, we need to either give direction as a board to pursue an ordinance like this, or go hardcore one way or the other on protection or non-protection. Or
including it in a special election.
Well, I don't think we would put it to a vote. That would have to be I'm saying, like, the community would need to have like the 5% of electors.
I mean, like, let citizens initiate the move.
Yeah.
Is what I really meant by
For
that.
sure. So I think we've got those 4 potential directions from the board.
Okay.
Pursue this.
I think what you brought up earlier is really important. I mean, I think like if this comes up to the board, the subject doesn't come up in relation as the ordinance, because if the town has to discuss the ordinance, then the discussion needs to be things like, should it be 25 feet or 15 feet?
Yeah, I don't think we should propose the ordinance. I think we should say, would you like to pursue an ordinance? Would you like us to protect non-jurisdictional, not protect non-jurisdictional? Or do we say, this isn't a decision for the trustees, the community needs to tell us what to do?
Okay.
And I think that puts us in the outcome is not weighted one way or the other by anyone's opinion like mine.
Is that a consensus? Sally?
This would be one other, it feels a little like an inordinate amount of decision-making influence here. No, I'm definitely comfortable with that.
Okay.
Well, also, this ordinance is already public. It went in front of the planning commission, and if someone doesn't like what this committee just gave direction to do, like, we can discuss that at the board too. Like Jim knows, Tyler knows, like, it's not a secret.
Yeah.
Jordan knows.
I know, I'm so glad you're here.
Does that sound like a fair?
I kind of want Jordan to be a part of this discussion, but I don't know.
I know that you're like diametrically opposed to me on this issue. So I also, like, other than the fact that I'm also okay with us saying, like, protect everything in development. I don't think we're opposed there, but I'm curious, like, from that discussion, are you okay with the direction that we just gave? I'm trying to be.
Yeah, I appreciate being included.
Okay.
And Lucy, are you okay with that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you for that.
That is clear direction that we will follow this time.
You've done plenty of self-deprecation on that, on that issue. It's okay. It was from a place of good intent.
For sure. All good.
Okay. Our next one is, I'm excited to announce that the town of Silverton received our EIAF DOLA grant in the amount of $75,000 to match our $75,000 budgeted for the land use code rewrite. So before you all is a draft RFP that I was hoping to get in front of the board on June 12th to get this project started as soon as possible. I am eager. We are all eager. So it actually worked out really well because we had this meeting. So I thought I would put this on there, and I've had Lucy, John, Clayton, and TJ look over this at this point. I think I didn't give TJ a chance to totally comment on it yet, but he's getting there. And wanted to get any comments or feedbacks that you felt needed to be included or edited or taken away. There were some minor edits that we did change in here, as just administrative edits, but since it has gone to you all in this packet.
I think it's awesome. I think
Yeah.
we should do it.
Okay.
And we had a chance to sort of connect on this conceptually the other day
Mhm.
too. So, it's awesome. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned about the turnaround time. I hope that's enough time for someone to put in a proposal, but I do have a list of people that I will be sending this out to as well from community builders.
Right. And I mean, I don't think we should be afraid of resubmitting it if that's
Right, we can extend the
Too.
deadline. if we need.
obviously we feel some urgency, but better to have the right response than a fast response. And the range of the $100,000 to $150,000 budget, do you want to comment on that?
I just wanted to keep it a range rather than saying, this is what we budgeted for, to see if anyone wanted to cut us a deal.
It seems like the code audit, like greatly expedites the overall process.
Yes,
Yeah.
actually, when I
That's
was
an awesome document.
looking at previous RFPs from other communities that went out for land use, like they started with what we've already done with CPS here. So and in CPS and I had a conversation on that I really need CPS there to help kind of be my planning director in this case and keep them on track and help manage this project. So they will not be submitting for this code rewrite.
Yeah, so the role of CPS in the project is the role of
Us.
town staff planner versus, applying for responding to the RFP.
Yeah, and if it's okay, I'll just throw a couple of words out there because we've done that before. We're happy to do that. But what I talked to Glory about yesterday was putting a little bit extra language in there, showing that we're contracted, but we're going to be acting on behalf of the town. We've been in other situations where that wasn't as clear, and it kind of puts us in a really awkward spot.
Okay.
So that's the only, it's just kind of a paragraph maybe about project management or something like that is all that we would do. But we're very happy to take that role on and very appreciative of it. So.
And I'm very appreciative of it as well.
Yeah, all of us.
I was
Yeah,
feeling really like it was all going to be on me and Lucy, and having you guys supporting us is just amazing. So thank you, TJ, and thank you, Chris. All right. All right. So that was quick and easy.
Now we're only 18 minutes behind.
Yeah.
That's not bad.
That's not bad. We're doing good. And then we have had preliminary discussions in the board of kind of looking into reducing numbers of trustees and maybe restructuring the board in some way, and then thinking about the elections, and all of this has kind of come up of, we do have an election coming up. We will have 5 seats up at that point. And if there's anything that we wanted to do, we would have to start this process kind of now. If that was, so I had Clayton look into reducing the number of trustees, and he wrote a white paper on that for you all. And then Jordan Bierma has a citizen council proposal here as well that was included to kind of, it's got a lot in there. And you're welcome to introduce it as well in this discussion. I didn't know if you wanted to start with the reducing the trustees. I know we had talked also about the way the mayor was elected. And
we can just kind of open it up if you want to start talking about it.
What's the best way? I mean, in terms of, I think your proposal, Jordan, if it's not clear in the video, Jordan, your proposal, I think is somewhat an independent discussion of the trustee reduction, which is much more specific. So do we want to just do that first or do we want to do that second?
I think Jordan's first.
Okay. Jordan, would you like to provide a summary of your proposal?
Sure, yeah.
And I did read it. I assume, yes, Sally also read it. So.
Yeah, I more or less wanted to comment if you had needed any clarifications or context or questions about it, but generally it's overarching theme is to kind of restructure local government and more community-based government approach to democratic and federalism. And yeah, big overarching title of it, I guess.
Okay, I'll kick off. I agree that government is structured in a way that feels pretty inefficient and people often feel underrepresented. I know that, like, if you think about us as citizens relative to federal decisions, like it feels like we have no voice whatsoever. So and in a smaller community, like we could potentially restructure in a way where everybody does feel like they have more voice. So I think that the foundation of your desire to do this is something that I identify with. Pragmatically, I don't know that the proposal is sufficiently fleshed out for it to be seriously considered. I don't know that, for example, like as a statutory town, like could we even consider a restructure similar to this? And if we can, I think in the proposal, it needs to have the statutory references that says like, here's what allows us to make these decisions and to pursue these things and not be in violation of Colorado state law. And similarly, like, do we need to become a home rule town in order to consider something like this? And if so, then the proposal also needs to say like first home rule town, then. So I think it needs to include the step-by-step and the basis under which we could consider it, and not just the outcome idea itself. So I think it's really hard for me to recommend this to go up to the board level for discussion until I know that it's at least an actionable idea, regardless of the merits. Is that fair? Or do you feel like that's unfair?
I think it's totally fair. I think it's, and I put this in my email to Gloria, I think it's not totally complete yet. I more or less want to know board feelings for like putting more work and effort into something.
I'd close the loop on my thought by saying, even though I identify with like where it's coming from and why it's a good idea, I also think that the potential for not being able to make decisions is really scary for me. Like trying to imagine how this would function. I see somewhat through my experience, like I agree with all of your critiques on how we exist and the challenges we faced as a board and as elected officials. I've come to a somewhat opposite conclusion personally that this is the best worst way to actually function, and that it would be cool to try something like what you're talking about, and there's the possibility of like a really good outcome, but there's also the possibility of like absolute failure and collapse and the inability to make decisions as a community. I think about some of the community discussions we've had, and if we didn't have the ability to like hit the mute button on the community portion of it, say, okay, guys, there's 7 or 5 or however many of us that need to actually take an action today, otherwise bad things will happen. I don't know that we actually would have been able to make decisions. So I'd love to be part of the experiment, but I'm also very concerned about the potential failure and what your plan, like the risk that you're taking on behalf of the community with that potential failure.
Sure.
That's the discussion I would have next if we find out that this is like something that's a permitted process.
I think kind of another part that's alluded to in there that hasn't been completely fleshed out would be that dual power sharing structure that would last 2 to 10 years. Mitigate that risk. I'd be curious to see what you think as far as what that looks like. And do you see it as being beneficial to be forced to make a decision in those aspects?
It's a big question. I don't know. But yeah.
Well, as an educator, this is just a really, this is like kind of a fun, I like enjoy things like this. So, and I happen to have been able to spend a little bit of time with Jordan talking about some of these issues. And so I appreciate, like, what I see here is that we've been doing this now for 3 years, and we're looking at it and we're like, there's some challenges and some problems, and let's try and think about this analytically and what would some of those fixes look like. And I think, trying to imagine this it's like an enjoyable mental exercise for me. Because I think local government is so special, and it's often brought up in much bigger contexts as like, you want to make a difference, local government, you don't believe in your federal government, you can believe in your local government. And I think, like, to have disconnect or not have that feeling in local government is unfortunate. So especially in a small town like Silverton, where you feel like you have some agency over some of those fixes. And I think, like, if we just said, yeah, Jordan, let's go for it. Let's see what this would happen. I actually think the feeling of the community would be like, I think the community would feel like it would be scary. Like, it would be like we maybe are misusing our power to sort of radically change a structure without a lot of sort of community process behind it. So, like, if I were to say in this P&O committee meeting, like, yeah, let's bring that ordinance to the agenda and let's talk about it in our next meeting, I think that would feel very jarring for the community and have sort of an opposite. I don't see the community showing up and being like, oh yes, finally you've come up with the fix. So I sort of had that thought on it. And then my other thoughts were sort of similar to Shane's, like, what are the legal structures that we're bound by as a town versus home rule. And then I think for me to really understand how this works and to, like, eliminate some of the fear of either worst case scenario or just how does this work? When do these people meet, and what if this person is gone for 6 months of the year? Just like some of those pragmatic details would be to sort of line it out and, like, this is how it would play out with this ordinance. So we have some models or some samples to experience what something so different would look like in our town. So while I really agree with you on your list of, the identification of the problems on the bulleted list, this is very true. This feels real to me. And then but I think it's just a really big leap into the fix, but I just don't want to sound like I'm, like, discouraging. I just think I'm with Shane. Like, if we really wanted to kind of commit to something so different, then I think it needs to come in a different form. Come with some models and making sure that it's, the right steps are in the right order so that the town can practically consider it.
Are there any real life examples of this structure in the United States or in Colorado? And it's okay if there isn't. Like, we don't have to only do things that other people do if they're possible, but it's like, is it possible? Are there examples?
Yeah, it's kind of a combination of multiple models. And currently some in the past, similar to the town halls in Vermont and some of the other places. Also, prior Revolutionary War, it was similar model to structures in the US. It's also currently being practiced on local municipalities and other countries, and then also soon internationally in places like Rojava. Successfully in that, I'm curious what your hypothetical fears are. I feel like the fears that you're bringing up are the same fears that I have of the current structure we have.
I totally.
Well, I also think the practical outcome is like, if you look at the community night on Friday or Monday, you know, we had the same 20 people show up that come to everything. And so I think there's like part of our nature, and maybe there's a way to create.
I think this is the design to kind of
I think this-
make you
have to-
not do that, to flip that.
Yeah.
That's the dual power sharing structure.
Yeah.
So you have to build the culture, and participate.
Yeah. And it'd be interesting, it would be really cool if we could figure out how to increase engagement and participation. But if all we did was implement without building that culture along the way, like it would be exactly the same as it is now, just.
That point is very critique, and I think that's the real challenge, is changing the culture in any capacity is really difficult. I mean, that's why we've got.
But my critique is like, I think more people need to kind of be aware of this option and start to talk about it and understand it and say, I can visualize this. I can visualize how this would work. I really want to advocate for this new structure, because if it came from the Board of Trustees and we were like, we're going to approve this ordinance, that is this old structure kind of, it feels a little backwards to me.
Well, it just hasn't gotten
No,
that
it's
far yet,
definitely
right?
backwards, but it's the only.
Well, it's not the only, like, it starts out by saying like, are you guys open to this conversation? And then you go out and then you like, the community starts building momentum around it, if you take it to that level.
Because it has to be, it's so community involved that if the community is not willing to be involved, then I think that's the word, that's to me, the failure. Is that the culture, that the community just doesn't show up to the neighborhood meeting, and then they don't identify the issues, and then they have I'm trying to come up with the fear. I mean, I wasn't having the fear that Shane was having, but like if there was a water main issue, or a certain collection of people had garbage, clutter collecting in their yards, and this neighborhood decides that this is okay, and they kind of have an apathetic, they stop attending the meetings. I don't know. I think like the failure would be that this is very much built on participation. So you'd have to have the participation.
And I think my thought process around kind of reacting to that is my fear would be, what we've already had is we had 3 seats open and we didn't have an election. Whoever just showed up joined town council. 15 times the amount of power as any other individual in town. And that seems to me being a greater risk than potentially community not participating in a process that's open.
An inordinate amount of power for someone who's just basically unelected. Yeah. I see that.
And that's not wrong.
Yeah.
Well, I think no matter what happens with your next steps on the proposal, like figuring out tangible ways to build a culture of participation is something that's good for all of us, no matter what. And that to spend effort on that also is only going to have positive effects on the community. And so if you have other ways that the board can also.
But what do you want to see as your next steps?
Yeah.
Like, what's the next move for you on this?
I think just being able to have broader discussions of the board about this, and not necessarily like pushing it forward as in like we want to change everything right now, but being able to communicate that with the community, or have a broader discussion as a board so we could flesh out some of these potential fears or risks, or I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, but I'm only one person, and it's helpful to have the brains of other people around you.
Is this something that could pop into our retreat?
I was just thinking the same thing. I was going to say though, that we should remove the outcome suggestion at this stage, at least until you've done all the research of like, is it possible? Like, rather than providing solutions at the structure level, I think it's really helpful to identify all the problems that you've identified and then to have a discussion around those problems. You have suggestions on some of the outcomes, but I think that the first step is having the discussion. Like, I think we all identify with your list of problems, and that's an interesting discussion in and of itself.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point, looking at the problem less than being able to brainstorm solutions. 'Cause
And-
yeah, there are solutions that have come to you.
And in the meantime, I don't think it's a
I do
waste of
agree.
your time to do that other research.
Possible. This fits within state statutes. From other people I've talked to, it seems like a gray area that. And yeah, it'd be good to just have it put in there.
Well, I think the challenge too is like, I don't think we can spend town resources on the research initially. I think you have to do that,
Yeah.
or you have to find a community group that's willing to do that.
No, and I'm working with some other organizations.
But yes, Sally, and Gloria, I think that Jordan's list of issues, I think, is an interesting potential discussion portion of the trustee retreat.
Okay.
Because I don't think that those are like unique to Jordan issues.
Great.
Anything? Okay. Cool.
Do you want to advocate for anything else?
I mean, if you guys have any other questions, criticisms, thoughts, clarifications from anyone, I'm always happy to hear them.
My only other one that I didn't bring up was just like, I'm just so practical in this that I just really want to know how this works with Gloria's role as an administrator, you know, how the system interacts with town staff, you know, how we have very clear directions, like almost like, you know, a hierarchy right now, like this is Gloria's job. I do not call Lucy directly, noted. We take direction of town staff. This is sort of like our procedure. I think that would be one more thing to kind of flesh out, like how that
Yeah, and that's.
representation works with our current staff and like what the hybrid to have, just what's the learning curve? Those are my big things.
More of a learning curve. I left some of those procedural things off just because there are like multiple routes to take to that, and I didn't want to like pigeonhole myself in.
Yeah.
Solution for that. But yeah, it's definitely a non-hierarchical structure and just very into the idea of self-supporting hierarchies of that. An example of that is me being a teacher. If I'm being a good teacher, my students won't need me. I see that role for town council ideally, like in that dual power structure, sharing that power, and like, again, that goes back to kind of, being able to eventually shift the cultural focus and get people to want to participate. Yeah. Bigger, broader ideas. I'll just throw out my input too while we're talking on the next subject of going down to 5 trustees. I'm sure you can imagine that I don't feel strongly about that. I think
Let's move on to that. I think we're ready.
I think that's consolidating more power into fewer people's hands, and I just not that in general. Just throwing that out there as public input, I guess, at this point.
I agree with Jordan on that. And that's a flip for me. I think because I tend to be somewhat practical and I try to seek efficiency as much as possible, just generally. I was very compelled by the 5 pitch and I thought a lot about it. And actually and then as I thought more about it, I experienced this on the preschool board. Because the preschool board started as a board of 7, and then we had like a complete drain of just residents. And so our board for a little while had to operate on like really bare bones. I think it was maybe 4 or 5 of us for a few meetings to just kind of keep operational. And our meetings definitely increased in efficiency. Our discussions were, I think actually I disagreed with Clayton on this in his analysis. Our discussions were really fast and they tended to be more groupthink. I don't know. I see Clayton's list here, but I don't know that that's really the best outcome for the community or for the, I don't know that that creates a higher quality decision. And I do.
And so, just so you're aware, I just wanted to weigh in. I don't have, this is not an opinion piece. So if you took any of my memorandum as a opinion one way or the other, then I apologize. It's not meant to be, it's just meant to be completely generic and give you a starting point.
Yeah. It sounded like these are some issues you may want to tease out in a discussion is how I read it. And that's actually how I started thinking about the preschool board, because I was like, wait, what actually happened when I experienced this on a board previously? So I kind of wanted to just lead that I've had some change. I've changed my thinking a little bit about in terms of just the number of board members I think we should have here.
I'm pretty 50-50. I mean, I see the benefits of both. I see concerns for both. Like for me, the biggest benefit of 7 is when people can't attend, we still have a large number of people making decisions with varying viewpoints. And I think there's less likelihood of massive swings from election to election with 7 board members versus 5. That said, having 7, sometimes there isn't enough interest in the community. Maybe through our work to build a culture of participation, we'll have more experiences like the most recent open seat where we had 4 people put in for it. And it won't be like the last time we had open seats and we had 3 people just essentially step into seats without an election. So maybe through other initiatives, we can eliminate that issue of there not being sufficient interest for there to be good candidates for the open spots. And maybe that's changing already. I also think it's really important that we can compensate the elected officials in a meaningful way. And I know that that's hard. It's not exponentially harder with 7 versus 5, but it definitely reduces the amount of compensation available. Spread 7 ways versus 5 ways, because I do think the biggest thing that limits our ability to have a wide variety of candidates for the seats is the time commitment. And that may or may not be impacted by like $1,000 a month pay.
Right. I mean,
like
I
it's
think
not enough to offset a full-time job or anything like that.
the county commissioner job, that's like,
I mean, even 30-something thousand a year still isn't enough for it to be your only thing in Silverton.
it's not,
unless you're
but it's
like
getting
retired.
very close to a teacher salary. So just throw that out there.
Yeah.
But we're not going to talk about a $30,000 increase. And so I think even if we went to, but I actually, just to go back to the 5-7 number, I think, oh, sorry, keep going. I just lost it.
I can keep talking. Yeah.
Keep talking.
But yeah, I think there's pros and cons to both 5 and 7. I think both have, like, neither's perfect. I'm okay with either. I think independent of the 5 and 7, I think we should pay the trustees and mayor more by at least 5 times right now. Like, I think the trustee pay is like $200 a month or something, $230 a month. Mayor's 400 something. I think it should be, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 per person per month. I do think that the way we do things right now, the mayor does spend more time than most trustees. That said, like, the people on the finance committee are probably spending close to the same amount of time that I'm spending on town related things when things are good. When things are bad, I would say then the mayor's like has way more demand. So I don't know that I don't think it should be 2 times. Like, I don't think the mayor should get 2,000. The trustees should get 1,000. Like right now it's 200, 400 or so. I think it should be a narrower gap as the numbers increase. And I do think we should consider a different way of vote. I think it's really important that we consider how we elect the mayor differently, because when I was elected,
That I agree with you.
I had to choose either trustee or mayor. And if I had, I mean, I use Gilbert as an example of this, where he had 50% community support and he's not on the board.
Mhm.
And it seems like we could do this differently where we either appoint the mayor like the mayor pro tem, where it's just the most number of votes in that election.
And they take a trustee seat.
Yeah, or it could be a rotating seat. I think anyone who's been elected is capable of being the mayor. It is a slightly different skill set, I think, as being more of a moderator, but as you know. But I think the binary.
So I think
nature of
it
the
is a
election
slightly
is a
different
big
skill
issue.
set. And that's why it matters that if you choose to run for mayor, that you're active, that we don't just take, like, I'm glad that I didn't have to become mayor because I
Had
was the most vote
yeah.
getters. Like, I wasn't running for that position. I wasn't interested in that role. And those did not seem like that was not my skill set.
Sure.
So,
I mean, there's also other ways, like trustees can appoint the mayor, like it can be a.
no, but I do think that votes choosing the mayor are a good, I mean, that's a good way to choose
Yeah.
the mayor. And I think that it's important. I would make the case, and I don't actually think it's important one way or another. So if someone wants to disagree with me on this, I'm completely open to the other perspective, but just from a practical matter, again, I think it's important that the person gets to choose whether that's the position they want to fill, because I think the role is significantly different, significant enough that the person should choose it and not just show up and be like,
You're the mayor.
now you're the mayor. So you're going to now take on these extra duties and you're going to have these moderating skills and
Yeah.
whatever else. But I also think that to lose the representation that someone who is running against the person who receives the most votes. In your case with Gilbert is unfortunate. And in the case of Silverton, where potentially we don't have a lot of candidates running, then that was a candidate who could have filled a seat, and represented a large portion of the community. So I think we should consider that.
Yeah, those are all really good points.
And I also thought about term limits. That was another idea that kind of came up, like how it doesn't seem like we have anyone right now who's just kind of like ready to sit in this seat for 20 more years, but
We definitely have mayor term limits. Oh,
do we? I don't
yeah,
know that we
I think
do.
Mayor Tukey turned out.
That is something
She was
I,
mayor for 2 or 3 terms. I think it's 2. I think mayor is a 2-term limit.
and do we want to have that for trustees? Because also in terms of representation, and it's something that Jordan and I have talked about like years ago is, and maybe this is why is the idea that our town is so small and this job, it's almost like, in a way, it's sort of like, maybe everyone needs to be a waiter or a waitress at some point in their life. They just maybe need to be on the jury every once in their life, or just have a certain sort of civic responsibility that, like, yes, I think it's important that we're elected because it shows support and it shows kind of like it's representation. And I also think that in a town as small as ours, and Jim Harper has actually alluded to this idea too, like sometimes it's just, maybe it's your turn to step up and be in this position as a civic duty. And so maybe we're not having hotly contested elections, but we are providing the seat for somebody to represent the community and have the opportunity to serve in this way, in this civic way.
Also, from those 3 issues, do you think it's worth having the member discussion at the board level?
I do think we have,
Even if it's just the same where everybody's like, oh, we really thought it was a good idea initially, but now we've thought about it. It's like, well, maybe we did. It's not worth changing it.
I think this idea came from a trustee who probably wants that to be discussed.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of first step of direction, like on the next, I guess timing's a bit of an issue.
But I wondered, I mean, I don't want to boot everything into a retreat, but because I think that with a discussion, we could come to pretty easy consensus. This doesn't feel contentious.
Well, I was gonna say the only thing that's an issue is because there's a 4-month
Oh,
window for.
yeah,
having
before the
vote.
election.
It's,
Mhm.
it's, do we care about this enough to make a decision before that window so that this would be affected before April?
Right.
Or is this, it doesn't feel like it's nearly as urgent as many of our other issues. And so our worst case scenario is we don't decide by April and that
Mhm.
there's another 2 years before it has a meaningful impact. But I would say it would make sense to put this on the next agenda that isn't as full as the next two.
Okay.
Which then seems like we're potentially just,
We might be bleeding
Into
into our
retreat time.
retreat time.
That's it.
Gloria, do you have a sense of that? Is this urgent to a trustee or several that aren't in the room right now?
I don't think it's urgent, it's just timely. So if we wanted to get it on an election, it would be something we would need to discuss and move forward with rather quickly, rather than waiting.
I
If-
just
if
don't
that's
think it's something we should move quickly on.
One of the questions that I asked, I'm curious if we have an answer to, is probably a Clayton question, but if we were to say this is super urgent, we desperately want to change it to 5 as fast as possible. Is this something we could combine with the OHV ballot issue to have at the same time to reduce administrative burden and cost, or is that the timing? It is something we could, if we
You can put this to a vote. If you have the petition numbers, you can put this to a vote with any regular or special election in conjunction with any other regular or special election.
And so since this is something that all of the trustees could actually put on the ballot, if we decided unanimously to put this on the ballot, does the timing work out that we could actually, because we're deciding on Monday whether or not to just accept the OHV petition or put it to a public vote. And I can say with confidence that the trustees are going to put it to a public vote, which will be sometime between August and October, I think. I forget exactly, but that's.
Yeah, we'll have to go back and look at the timeline, but that's about right.
And so based on that timing, is this something that if we were to prioritize, could make it in that same timeline to join that ballot?
Yeah,
issue?
there's no minimum parameters for this. It just says that once you put it to a vote, if it's decided unanimously, and I mean a vote of the board, then you can send it to the electorate in any special election or regular election. So technically you could do it even quicker if you wanted to, but of course, for administrative purposes, you'd want to combine this vote with any other scheduled elections.
Okay, thank you.
This is all hypothetical, of course.
Yeah, of course. So the only reason to consider this as an urgent thing, like Gloria said, is that it's timely that, we do have 5 open seats the next election. If we were to put this into the same
But to
process,
me, that's
and
a
it'd be
reason
3
to
instead of
not
5.
change that.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the
Oh, I'm not
opposite
saying, I'm just saying.
take on it. I just think we have a lot of open seats. And the idea that we would shrink our board at the same time that we have a lot of open seats.
Well, it would give
Seems
the 2
disruptive.
continuing board members a stronger voice. It would actually reduce the uncertainty of the number of open seats.
Mhm.
Because whatever 5 divided by 7 is the percentage that's open versus 3 divided. by
Yeah,
7.
yeah.
But I feel like based on our lukewarm nature of this, whether it's good or bad, it sounds like not something that, if we were all we gotta be.
Right,
5,
right.
And I'd say, let's move on it. It sounds like we're not there. So I'd say, let's put this on the middle tier priority of when we have time to consider as a board,
Yeah.
whether that's at the retreat or at a meeting.
And if it makes an election, it
Yeah.
does. If it doesn't go to an election, it doesn't. If the board doesn't make it happen, then it comes up in 2 more years.
We just had 3 1-hour meetings, so we probably missed our opportunity, but. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah. But I would actually escalate the priority level of the compensation conversation,
Yeah.
because you have to,
We can't do it for the current sitting board.
so we can't increase our own
Mhm.
compensation, but we can increase it for the 5 new trustees that will be elected in April. So I would like to have that compensation discussion and decision before April.
And I think something to support that discussion, Gloria, would be to have an idea from you and the finance committee about what
we can afford.
we can afford and how that looks over time.
And I would assume 7 members for the purposes of that discussion.
Mhm.
Okay.
Because to me, I would rather, if it's the difference between making $1,000 and making $700 a month, but increasing our representation and having more robust discussions and potentially having just meetings with more of us attending if we're absent, and to sit on committees and, you know, all of the extra things, I would take less money. Because it's just not significant.
Right. So it wouldn't be increasing your responsibilities per se, but just the compensation at this point,
Mhm.
because it is.
But responsibilities, if, to put this back into the 5 and 7 discussion, of a 5-person board, the responsibilities would then increase significantly because you would have only 5 people to serve on all of the committees and attend all of the meetings. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe they're tied together too. It's like if we got to the point that this was more of a real job with real compensation, 5 would be okay. That level of responsibility is like also moving the opposite direction of what Jordan's proposing, but
Yeah.
I think that nominal compensation 7 is probably better.
I kind of think in any compensation, 7's better.
Yeah.
But I'm not gonna fall on a sword for it. Okay, what else? Are we done?
That's it.
That's all I have.
Mhm.
It is 5:41 and we can adjourn this meeting.
Thank you. And thank you to the CPS people that left, and
Yeah.
thank you to Lucy, and everybody have a good night. So yeah, 5:41. Thank you. Adjourned.
Thank you.